Assembly in 2016, and the topic of my part of a broader presentation was Lutherans in the Holy Land and addressing the question, how in the world did this happen? How did Lutherans end up in this part of the world? We typically associate Lutherans with Scandinavian and other European countries such as Germany, and with missionary efforts in Africa, but not so much in the Holy Land. So, how did this happen? Essentially, I've divided the history of the Lutheran presence in the Holy Land into three phases. The first phase consists of early missionary efforts. The second, I'll talk about German colonial interests in the region. And finally, I will briefly discuss what happened post the two world wars and the Israeli War for Independence. First, the early missionary effort, so roughly 1600 to 1800. Early on, missionaries were sent to this part of the world by primarily German and Swedish concerns, Lutheran churches. And at this time, this area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which you may recall from high school world history. So, this is the Ottoman Empire in about 1801. It's controlled out of Istanbul in modern day Turkey and covers modern day Greece and the Middle East, what we think of as Egypt, Jordan, and Israel. Those countries didn't exist per se at that time, and also northern Africa. So this was the Ottoman Empire controlled by a leader referred to as the Sultan. The area was populated by a mixture of Christians, Jews, and Muslims, so sometimes we lose track of the fact that not only was the Ottoman Empire primarily Muslim, but that there were also Christians and Jews in this area during the entire time. So when missionaries arrived here, um, they knew that they should be doing mission work, but they couldn't really quite decide what their objectives should be. So, should they be primarily focused on trying to convert Muslims to the Christian faith, focusing on converting Jews to the Christian faith, or doing some sort of other work? And there were lots of different ideas, some major disputes, including a falling out of some coordinated ministries between the Anglicans and the Lutherans. So both Anglicans and Lutherans still to this day have a presence in Jerusalem. Eventually, the Lutherans settled on what they called literacy evangelization and vocational training in terms of what their mission should be in this part of the world. So, why these two particular points of focus? Well, really, this does fit well with Lutheran values. Luther himself was a big advocate of universal education that included girls, and in particular in this part of the world, education of young girls was not seen as vital in the social sphere of things. So this was really a new idea that everybody should be included in education. Of course, Luther was adamant that literacy is necessary for reading the Bible and for an informed laity. So Luther was a big part of increasing lay literacy in Europe, and so too these early missionaries thought that increasing literacy in this part of the world was a good fit for a Lutheran mission. Also, service to the neighbor, particularly vulnerable neighbors. So, as Luther famously said, it's not God that needs our good works, but our neighbors, understood broadly, are very much in need of our good works and our help. So, much of the Lutheran orientation was oriented around providing health care, setting up institutions such as orphanages and so forth. And finally, the idea of the dignity of everyday work and vocation. So, teaching people a trade was more than just providing a social service, it was really part of the mission of a Christian. So, Luther famously said that the Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship. So, teaching people the dignity of work and the value of work and the value of doing a skilled trade was very much seen as in line with Lutheran values by these early missionaries. In the second phase, which we'll call the German presence from 1600 to approximately 1948, we find that this part of the world is becoming more and more dominated by Germans and a German presence. The Germans were really interested in the region primarily because of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So you maybe also remember this from high school world history, that the Ottoman Empire for centuries was known as the sick man of Europe, and the empire was seen as falling apart. And so the Germans, as well as the British and the French, were all very, very interested in coming to this part of the world and having a presence there. So the British and the French in particular were successful in doing that, but the Germans felt they were sort of late to the colonial enterprise, felt that they too should have a presence, particularly in Jerusalem. And this was a point of pride for them, that there certainly should be a German and a Lutheran presence in Jerusalem among the other world religions that were present there. So, with that German interest came a huge influx of diplomats and businessmen and scholars, German Bible scholars, coming to Jerusalem to study. So, there became a fairly large German community. And in 1850, Protestants were granted official status by the Sultan. So that meant that Protestants could actually establish churches in this part of the world. And the Sultan did this in an effort to modernize the Ottoman Empire, to try to bring Ottomans up to speed with where he felt the rest of Europe was. So, being a cooperative part of Europe was seen for a period of time as the way to rescue the empire from disintegration. But then, where to build new churches? So it's one thing to have permission to build new churches, but where should they be built? Or where are you going to get property to actually build a church? So eventually, new institutions were founded in this period of German colonialization. And the Sultan gave Kaiser Wilhelm II, I believe, two prime pieces of property in Jerusalem. It's kind of a nice gift to show alignment with German interests. So here's a nice photo of Kaiser Wilhelm and his wife, Augusta Victoria, and I like this photo because that has to be about the best hat ever, I think. So one of the pieces of property was very near to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, it's across the street. And the Germans built the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer in 1898. And the Kaiser actually traveled to Jerusalem to dedicate the church, so it was a big deal, and very successful. So here is a current picture of the Church of the Holy Redeemer. If you've been to Jerusalem, you might have seen it. Very much built in the German style with German imported stones, marble. And the second piece of property is what is known as the Augusta Victoria complex. This is on the Mount of Olives, so this came along a little bit later, but not much later, 1907. And this is an interior shot of the Augusta Victoria complex, which is now a hospital, but was originally built as a guest house for German travelers and pilgrims, as well as kind of a social center for the German community in Jerusalem. So you might have parties and various celebrations held here. So kind of a German center for Jerusalem. Also, in terms of new institutions, a group called the Kaiserwerth Deaconesses founded a hospital and a school for girls and a nursing school. And the Kaiserswerth Deaconesses grew up was founded by a young Lutheran pastor named Theodor Fliedner, and they're called this because they came from Kaiserswerth, Germany. And he had traveled across Europe in the early 1800s and was appalled by suffering and the fact that the sick and the poor and the aged were not being taken care of. So he went on a campaign to invite young, unmarried women to join them, and this flourished into a group called the Kaiserswerth Deaconesses. And they were primarily dedicated to healthcare. An interesting little side note is that Florence Nightingale, of British fame, studied with the Fliedners on a couple of occasions and stayed with the Deaconesses for a few months in 1851, and was quoted to have said, "I never have I met with a higher love, a purer devotion than here." So they were a model of nursing and healthcare for Florence Nightingale. And also another prominent family was the Schneller family, who founded an orphanage and a number of vocational schools throughout the region, actually. So even today, you may run across a Palestinian that was or knows of somebody that was educated in a Schneller school. Here's a nice photo of the Schneller family, very staid and stern looking Germans. So eventually, beyond the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, there were a number of Lutheran congregations founded, and these congregations eventually included Arab congregants. These were primarily converts from Orthodoxy, from Eastern Orthodoxy. So the congregations were mixed, European, primarily German, and Arab. Finally, we'll talk about the third phase, which I've divided into 1948 to today. So what happens next? The Germans leave or are deported post-World Wars, so really after World War II and the Israeli War for Independence. Germans, as you might recall, fought on the side of the Ottomans, or the Ottomans fought on the side of Germany in World War I, and even though the Germans lost the war, they stuck around this part of the world, but eventually the area came to be dominated by the British, and after World War II, really, and with the influx of Jews and the Holocaust, Germans were more or less driven out of this part of the world. The Augusta Victoria complex, which remember was again first founded as kind of a German social center and a guest house, but then used as a hospital during World War I, again kind of became a German social center before World War II, and there were even some Nazi rallies there, believe it or not. But eventually the property was granted to the Lutheran World Federation, and it once again became a hospital and still functions as a hospital today. What is the legacy of this sort of varied German and Lutheran effort in colonializing this part of the world and founding churches as well. So we now have still 6 Arab congregations united as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land, which is a mouthful, and their acronym ELCJHL, which is also a bit of a mouthful. But there are still continuing congregations. These congregations still function minus their original German components. So these are Arab congregations now. And they have very lively and important ministries in a number of areas. So, healthcare, which is actually undertaken still by the Lutheran Federation in the form of Augusta Victoria Hospital, one of the leading hospitals in the region, providing very high tech ministries in terms of things like cardiovascular care, diabetes care, so dialysis, and cancer treatment, so things that people probably don't have available in other hospitals are provided by Augusta Victoria. Education for all in Lutheran schools, so a number of schools are still operated by congregations, by Lutheran congregations functioning in this area, and they educate around 3,000 elementary students per year. So they're substantial schools, and they are education for all in the truest sense. So whether you're Christian or Muslim, you're welcome to the school, whether you're a boy or a girl. It's open to anyone. As well as vocational training, and probably most notably in a upper education, or sort of an upper division education, college education, that people can receive at Dar al-Kalima in Bethlehem. And you may be familiar with that institution, which is currently building a large library and social center and focuses on providing vocational training for Palestinians in the West Bank in areas as diverse as filmmaking, culinary arts, and so forth. So the original focus of those first missionaries in the area of healthcare and education and vocational training was taken up even after they left by Arab Christians and continues on into the current day.